This passage is notoriously one of the worst to have to preach on because there's so much going in it that unless you have like a master's degree in theology, you're like, what? What's going on there? So we'll do my best here. It starts out with Sadducees, who are one of the religious groups in ancient Israel. Any faith tradition has various factions within their system of how they think about things. In Islam, it's the Sunnis and the Shia and the Sufis and the Ismailis. In Judaism, it's the Orthodox and the Conservative and the Reformed. In Christianity, you have Eastern Orthodox and Catholic and Anglican and Lutheran and Baptists and Presbyterian. There's lots of factions, right? Same in ancient Judaism. There were Pharisees and scribes and Sadducees and perhaps others. We don't know a lot about all of them, but we do have some sense that the Sadducees were part of the religious elite in Jerusalem. They were probably chief priests, a group made up of chief priests, and they seem to only have read the first 5 books of Moses. So their scriptures were Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which in Judaism is called the Torah. It's sometimes called the Pentateuch, but it was those 5 books that they read. And if you just have those books as your foundation for your faith system, there's no real afterlife talked about in those books. There's no sense of a hereafter talked about in those books. So the Sadducees did not believe that there was a life after death. So they're Jewish folks who believe there is no life after death. Now, if you read some of these other books, like Job that we read today, there's this hint of, Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives. After all of his suffering, after all of his grief, he comes up with this profound statement, I know that my Redeemer lives, and I know that even when I die and my flesh is rotted away, in some sense, I shall still see my God. Job has a hint of some sort of essence, some sort of our being after life, but not the Sadducees. When you read Deuteronomy and Moses gives the law, these are the laws of God that you should follow. These are the laws that will keep the people of Israel separate and help them flourish in the world. The end of Deuteronomy says, the last couple chapters basically say that if you follow these laws, it will be good with you here on earth. And if you don't follow these laws, it will not be good with you here on earth. Right? And the on earth part is there is no sense of if you follow these laws, you're going to get into heaven. And if you don't follow these laws, you're going to be tormented for eternity in hell. That is not what Moses taught. Right? That's something that develops later in the Christian tradition. But it's actually not a biblical perspective, believe it or not. But there is fundamentally a conviction that develops with both in Judaism and Christianity of life after death, of resurrection. Right? And not just Jesus' resurrection, but of our resurrection from life into some sort of deeper life. Because God is the giver of life. God is the giver of all good things. But the Sadducees didn't believe it. Right? And I find it interesting, as I've been reading the Bible, our tendency is to want to always side with Jesus, because Jesus is the good guy, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes are the bad guys. And I found it actually really helpful if I start putting myself in the position of the Pharisees, because then all of a sudden stuff Jesus starts saying begins to make sense, and I realize, I'm more like a Pharisee than I am a follower of Jesus, or I'm more like a Sadducee than I am a follower of Jesus. I do a lot of memorial services and funeral services, and I know from this, at least in this part of the world, in this area around Vancouver, in that area around Seattle, in that area around Portland, some people call it Cascadia, but in this part of the world, we tend to be skeptical about some things, right? And there's a real sense that actually, we're not sure that anything happens after you die. That in many ways, all you get is this life, and afterwards, probably nothing else. Your atoms go and they become, your atoms and your molecules are then absorbed into creation, right? Somebody was telling me about a friend of theirs who her plan is to be cremated and then buried beneath a cherry tree, so the cherry tree will absorb her remains and she'll become a cherry tree. And that's a lovely image, right? It's a lovely way to go. And I think that example is kind of typical of often how many of us think about the afterlife or what happens after we die. So, if I'm going to be honest with myself, yeah, I got a little Sadducee in me. Sometimes that makes sense, right? Sometimes it makes sense that maybe this is all that there is. Right? I got some of that in me. And so I don't want to dismiss the Sadducees entirely, but I want to kind of listen. All right, there's good reasons why they believe what they believe. Another thing you need to know about this story is what's called levirate marriage. Often people talk about a biblical view of marriage without really understanding that marriage and our ideas around marriage evolve and develop over time. Today we believe in, that romance and friendship and is an important part of what constitutes marriage and why you would marry somebody. In most traditional cultures where you have really clearly defined gender roles in terms of what's women's work and what's men's work, marriage is a lot more pragmatic. Often marriages are arranged, that sense of and often they're very successful. I don't want to denigrate them, but they're not based on romance and friendship as much as they are based on other things. There's kind of pragmatism to it. So in this particular gospel passage, the Sadducees, who are committed to the laws of Moses, are referencing Deuteronomy 25. And I don't imagine most of us have been reading Deuteronomy recently. If you have, I don't want to, make assumptions about your reading habits. But this is what Deuteronomy 25, and it talks about levirate marriage. When brothers reside together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Instead, her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. But if the man has no desire to marry his brother's widow, then his brother's widow shall go up to the elders at the gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. The elders of his town shall summon him and speak to him. If he persists, saying, I have no desire to marry her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal off of his foot, spit in his face, and declare, this is what is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. Throughout Israel, his family shall be known as the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. The Sadducees took that very seriously, by the way. Our laughter is a result of, you get a sense, this is a very different culture and a very different time, right? And there are lots of good reasons why that's a very traditional, and the folks in that culture do take that very seriously. And part of it is about perpetuating a man's lineage, right? After he dies, you want to perpetuate if he has no children, then his name will die with him. And so you want to help perpetuate his lineage. It's also about the biblical mandate to care for widows and orphans, right? So if you have a woman who, in that culture, it's a patriarchal culture, and she doesn't have, male relatives to help kind of support her and defend her. She's just more vulnerable. And so part of it's a matter of saying, well, protecting her and protecting her as part of the family. So the brothers, if a man dies and he has brothers, his brothers have an obligation to care for her and protect her and take her on as one of their wives, right? So there are reasons why people do that. That's one of the biblical views of marriage. It's not a view of marriage that we would recognize, though, right, or practice today. But that's what the Sadducees are referencing. The Sadducees who don't believe, but the Sadducees here aren't being honest, right? It's not like they've been sitting there and seriously wondering about the question that they're about to ask. They think the question they're about to ask is ridiculous. They think it's ridiculous, right? They think that any belief in a resurrection is ridiculous. And so they're going to ask Jesus a ridiculous question because they think he's ridiculous. Right? And that's where they say, Master, in the resurrection, since you believe in the resurrection, you got a man who marries a wife and he dies, and he's got a brother and he marries her and they don't have any children and he dies, and there's a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth and a seventh, and they all marry her and none of them have children. Whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection? Right? You have a real sense on their part of like, gotcha. How are you going to answer this one? And Jesus, actually, his response is, well, part of the problem is that you're making an assumption that what we do here and now is going to be the same thing as the hereafter. That things operate here, and that you're being very concrete, right? You're being kind of very literal-minded and thinking that somehow what happens here it's going to be like that. And he's like, yeah, here we marry and are given in marriage, but not when we die. When we die, that's a different state of being, right? It's like you live in the third, we live in space and time, the third dimension and the fourth dimension. We live in space and time. Once you die, you leave space and time. And you enter into some other dimension, a fifth dimension or whatever, we don't know. And people are not given in marriage in that dimension. But something of us persists in the resurrection. And we're like angels, we're like children of God, loved by God. That's Jesus' response. He's basically saying, you don't know what happens after we die. None of us knows what happens after we die. But we do. He has the conviction, and he's saying, you guys don't have a conviction of any resurrection or life after death, but he has a conviction of resurrection, right? And then Jesus does, he does this thing where he changes, he's like, you guys aren't thinking about this deep enough. You're being very literal and concrete. You can't step into the ambiguity of not knowing and yet having a deep conviction and hope, which is actually a more mature spiritual posture, right? Early on, we want things to be concrete and we want things to be black and white. And as you grow up, you realize, things aren't always concrete and black and white. And sometimes you just don't know. But you have hope that it might be this way. And you live in the conviction of that hope. And so Jesus then he's like, you guys think that Moses doesn't believe in the resurrection, but let me prove you wrong. Don't you remember the story where Moses encountered God in a burning bush, right? And he was out there and he came by this bush and it didn't seem to be consumed by a fire that was blazing in it. And he heard the voice of God say, take off your sandals, for you are on holy ground. And so Moses took off his sandals and approached the bush and had this conversation with God. And Moses said, who are you? Tell me your name. And God said, I am. I am that I am. That is my name. And I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob. And Jesus is like, remember that story? It's all in present tense. God doesn't say, I was the God of Jacob. I was the God of Abraham. I was the God of Isaac. They're dead. We would normally speak of them in the past tense, but Moses doesn't do that. He speaks of them in the present tense as if they're still alive. Therefore, Moses believes in the resurrection. That's Jesus's. And then he says, gotcha. He says, any more questions? And they're like, no more questions. And that's how this gospel text plays out. So some days I have days that I feel like I'm a Sadducee and I'm not sure. There are other days where I'm captivated by the conviction of hope, that this is not all that there is, that life is stronger than death, and that somehow when we die we move from life deeper into life. We move from this experience deeper into the goodness of God, where we are held in some way with the divine, with all of those who've gone before us. Right? And that's a conviction that the church has had throughout its history. It's deeper in Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Catholic churches. They definitely have this vibrant sense of this life that persists, and we're all held together. We talk about the communion of saints in the Apostles' Creed. Protestants are a little less convinced about it all, but there is just this definite sense that, those who've gone before us still exist in some real important, meaningful way in the presence of God. As we were last couple of years going through truth and reconciliation, learning more about truth and reconciliation with First Nations folks, and it struck me that what's important to a lot of First Nations and Aboriginal cultures is the experience of the ancestors, right? And this emphasis on the ancestors and those who've gone before us, and the importance of our gratitude, that gratitude towards them for what they've given us and how they've shaped and formed us, but also a sense that they can still see us. Also a sense that they're still with us, right? And I don't think that the Christian notion of those things is exactly the same as First Nations' sense of ancestors, but I do think there's a kind of a Venn diagram overlap, and that historically the church has had a sense that those who've gone before us are now outside of space and time, and so they actually, it's like you're in, if you're in two dimensions and you go into the third dimension. If you're like living in a town and you're sitting there walking and on the streets, you only see it at one level, and then when you finally climb to the top of a hill and you can look down on your city, you see it in an entirely different way. There's almost a sense that that's what's happened in some parts of Christian teaching, that's what's happened for those who've gone before us, that they've now outside of space and time, and they're present to us in a way that they weren't before. That's part of the way that the church has explained the communion of saints. So this day, and there's a time in the church year where we acknowledge that, we celebrate that, called All Saints and All Souls. And All Saints was just November 1st. It's specifically this is more of a Catholic thing. It's specifically the people that the Catholic Church has canonized as saints: St. Lawrence, St. Catherine's, the big saints who were martyred and did phenomenal things that seem beyond all of our capacity to do. Like, they were much better people than we were, so we're going to celebrate them, right? But they're models. They're intended to be role models. And then All Souls is that day where we remember those who've gone before, who actually were important mentors and loved ones. Anglicans, we like to conflate all that together. And not make those differentiations. I remember in my own life, my grandmothers played that role of showing me. They were two people in my life who really showed me love and showed me what the love of God might look like, and who really showed me what deep faith would look like, each in their own unique way, right? And so when I think about my ancestors, when I think about the saints in my life, I often think about my grandmothers and their role in my life. And this season is a time where we're able to remember those individuals who've gone before and have gratitude for what they've done, right? Whether you're a Sadducee or somebody who is really diehard on the resurrection, either or, it's a day to kind of remember those who've gone before. And I think it's important that we do that. So we're going to do that today in our service. Maggie and Dan are going to play this lovely piece of music. And during that piece of music, I invite you just to reflect on the people who've gone before in your lives, the saints in your lives, the role models, the people who you've deeply impacted you, and have a sense of gratitude for them. I know some of you will also feel loss and grief at that because they're no longer with us, and so the absence is left behind. So I invite you to let that grief enter into this holy space and let it be held by God and let it be held by us too, right? So Maggie and Dan are going to play that music. Let yourself remember your loved ones. After that, we'll rise and we'll say a brief liturgy. And then I'm going to invite you to just start speaking their names. Say those names out loud and fill this room with the chorus of those folks who've gone before us, right? And we will all speak over each other's voices, and it will just be this chorus of names of the people who've impacted us. And let us fill this room with their memory, right? And have a sense of the communion of saints as we do that. And then we will sing a song together. So.